We did talk about the president when we started the show, but this time it's on a different table. Well, President Bola Tinubu has submitted a request to the House of Representatives seeking the approval to borrow over 1 trillion naira as part of the 2024 Appropriation Act. The president's request was delivered to the House in 3 separate letters, where he also urged the lawmakers to consider the passage of the 2025 to 2027 medium-term expenditure framework, the fiscal strategy paper, and the amendment of the bill for the establishment of the National Social Investment Program. Well, a correspondent, Idong Joseph, has been and definitely followed this story in this report. Take a look.
The legislative business for the day began after a week-long recess with the presentation of 3 letters from President Bola Tinubu to Parliament. The first letter requested Parliament to consider the 2025 to 2027 medium-term expenditure framework and the fiscal strategy paper.
The House is hereby invited to note that as the 2025 budget of the federal government will be prepared based on the parameters and fiscal assumptions of the approved 2025 to 2027, it is imperative to seek the National Assembly's expeditious legislative action on this submission.
The second letter requested Parliament to amend the National Social Investment Program Bill, which aims to improve the implementation of the government's social investment programs.
Pursuant to Section 58 subsection 2 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria 1999 as amended, I forward herewith for the consideration and passage by the House of Representatives the National Social Investment Program Agency Establishment Amendment Bill 2024.
The final letter from President Bola Tinubu sought the approval of Parliament to borrow over $2.2 billion as part of the 2024 Appropriation Act.
I write to request for a resolution of the National Assembly to raise the sum of 1,767,610,321,779 naira, provided as new external borrowing in the 2024 Appropriation Act to part finance the budget deficit of 9.179 trillion in the 2024 budget.
The House then resolved to tackle other business of the day as lawmakers address pressing issues.
The extrajudicial killing of Mrs. Kelechi Augustine Ibe in Bonny local government area. They pray the House to investigate the murder of Mrs. Kelechi Ibe by the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency and compensation for the family of the deceased.
As well, recognizing the attack that was done on the convoy of Honorable Jinja Omosibe and leading to the death of some security personnel, the House is deeply concerned about this threat and violence that poses a disruption to peace.
With legislative business resuming, many Nigerians will be hoping that lawmakers can contribute positively to the development of the country. In Abuja for News Central, I am Idong Joseph.
Well, what a conversation there. Well, joining us to look into this, we do have a public affairs analyst, Ayo Lawal, who joins us this morning. Welcome, and thank you so much for buying time to be here this morning. Well, do you think that a cross-section of Nigerians, especially those in power, lack the temerity to question the current administration on its numerous borrowings? Because right now, in 9 months, the president has borrowed so much, I mean, a total amount of about 50 trillion in terms of borrowings. What's your thought on this?
Well, I mean, the level of borrowing is extremely worrying. And unfortunately, it would appear that the reason you don't see a lot of demands in that direction is largely because I do not think that Nigerians appreciate enough the sinking hole that we're likely to find ourselves if this strategy persists. Because the reality, obviously, is that we're tying so much of our revenue on loan repayments or debt servicing, that there is very little left to fund critical infrastructural development projects, that there's very little left to fund, education or healthcare, or even to fund social investments programs, given the severity, of inflation in our country today and the hardship that is widespread across the country. The reason why you're not able to fund as many social investment programs as the government itself had alluded to is largely because a lot of our funds, a lot of our revenue is essentially tied to debt servicing and loan repayments. And that puts us in a very, very terrible fiscal state and leaves us with very little room for maneuver in terms of socioeconomic development. So I do think that while many Nigerians might not appreciate the level of damage that this is doing to our economy, you would expect that opposition politicians in the National Assembly should be able to stand up to resist these kinds of borrowings. Because, you see, the truth is, the problem is not so much the borrowing, it's what the borrowing is spent on. Right? Because, for instance, in your monologue, you talked about the fact that, the government was seeking another 2.2 billion, which essentially was to fund the budget deficit, isn't it? So what we're doing essentially is to borrow $2.2 billion to fund another budget deficit, which is obviously consumption and recurrent expenditure. And it means that that 2.2 billion is essentially not going to other productive sectors of the economy. So we are consistently widening our budget deficits and continuously borrowing to fund that same deficit. So it's a vicious cycle that we found ourselves in. And, it has grave implications for not just foreign exchange stability, but of course for macroeconomic fundamentals within the economy.
Yeah, this is still 2024's budget we're speaking about. So for those who may not understand, economic terminology well enough, help us understand better. Does this mean that when the 2024 budget was being drawn, the Nigerian government didn't put its figures in order well enough with regards projections on how the budget will be funded? And, is this the same thing we're going to experience in 2025? Because there's already, a projected budget deficit of, about 10 trillion, I believe, for 2025. So is it that they, failed to draw up their figures well enough for 2024? Or this was already expected to happen, that just before the end of the year, we would have to borrow more to fund the 2024 budget?
Well, historically, the Nigerian government has never been good with budget estimates. We've always fallen short of all our budget estimates in several years and times past. We don't make the right projections in terms of exchange rates. We don't make the right projections in terms of, the amount of crude that we're going to produce and export. So it's become cultural. When was the last time that we got our production of crude right in terms of budget estimates? So it's no surprise that, we haven't gotten it right this time. But I think the elephant in the room here, and the reason why we have to again now borrow to bridge this deficit, is largely because of, the collapse, the volatility of the exchange rates, the fact that, our currency has lost significant value over the last couple of months. Because at the time that these estimates were made, the Naira was exchanging for about 800 to 900 Naira to a dollar, and now it's ballooned to about 1,700 Naira to a dollar. And that means that, your foreign loans have become more expensive to service, and it explains why you're now running to the National Assembly to get more loans to bridge that deficit. So the real problem here is the foreign exchange volatility, and largely the fact that our currency has depreciated over that period of time, which has made foreign loans a lot more costlier, and that's why we have to borrow more to service those loans. So we're borrowing more at a higher interest rates, which also now puts pressure on foreign exchange. It makes it very difficult to stabilize, and that means that going forward, we'll be paying more to service those loans, because it means inadvertently that our currency will continue to depreciate, because we're putting a lot of pressure on our fiscal straits. Because as long as your budget deficits continues to widen and you're using external loans to fund those deficits, it's going to put more pressure on your foreign exchange and will make stability almost impossible to achieve, which means your currency is likely to also depreciate further, and that means you will need more funds, to pay higher loans in future. So it's a vicious circle that we found ourselves in. I don't, these are times that while you hate to call for prayers to solve economic problems, that might be the only option available to most Nigerians now, given the gross economic mismanagements that we're experiencing.
I mean, you just talked of prayers, and it just took me aback to a popular preacher who said the intervention of God stopped the naira from getting to 10,000 naira. Stopping the naira from getting to 10,000 to $1. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that story. But then again, from DMO office, that's the Debt Management Office, it projected that each Nigerian owes 620,000 naira in debt, especially with these borrowings. It's likely going to rise. It's looking that way, that each Nigerian may end up owing about, if not 1.5 million naira, due to the way Nigeria is going in terms of borrowing. Could you help us see the risk and the worry that every Nigerian should have? Because these borrowings are becoming one too many.
So I think that the biggest risk that we face as a country is the fact that you're not going to have enough resources to fund critical infrastructural projects. You're not going to have enough resources to fund, education, human capital development. You're not going to have enough to fund and drive local productivity. I give a very typical example. About 12 months ago, the president had, said that they were going to fund or put together an intervention fund for SMEs across the country, and voted 75 billion to fund that intervention for SMEs who were dealing with liquidity issues, given the high interest rates and things like that. It's been close to a year now. The government has been unable to fund 75 billion, a paltry 75 billion. And the reason is because resources are scarce, right? And that's the potential danger that we face, because the more that you tie many of your funding to loan repayments and all of those obligations, the less you have to be able to fund critical infrastructural development that is likely to drive productivity of your economy, which by extension means that you will struggle to meet the 4.6 or the 6.4% growth that has been projected in the midterm expenditure framework that the government had also submitted to the National Assembly. It also means that you're unlikely to create as much jobs as is required to raise wages and to raise consumption within the economy. And it's likely also that poverty gap is also going to widen. That's the danger that we face if we continue along, this trajectory. And it's also worrisome that despite the evidence that we're in a dire fiscal strait, it appears that those in government and those in authority do not appreciate enough, or have not lived enough by example to demonstrate in their own dealings enough fiscal discipline and enough ability to prioritize public expenditure on things that drive productivity and growth, and not on wasteful exercises, that only, amounts to waste, if you ask me. And it's going to get worse, because that in the 2024 budget, we're going to be voting more in terms of salaries and allowances because of the new minimum wage that has increased. So we're going to find ourselves with more inflationary pressures in the next year, and more monies that are going to be tied to overheads, to loan servicing, to consumption, and you're going to have little that is going to be voted, for critical infrastructure and driving productivity. So if you asked yourself, the main argument that was given for the removal of petrol subsidy was that government was going to have enough more funding to drive some of these projects and to losing government expenditure. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. It doesn't also help that the NNPCL, that is supposed to remit taxes, royalties to the federal government, has significantly defaulted in doing that in the last several months. In fact, if you looked at the total amount that the NNPC remitted to the federal government in 2021, it was about $11.3 billion. At the end of 2023, it had remitted estimated just $2.3 billion, almost a 69% shortfall in revenue that are accrued to the federal government. So you look at this in its entirety, and it's not only scandalous as it is worrying, it is the fact that we seem to be driving ourselves into the lagoon, using flowery neoliberal words like market fundamentalism and market-led economy, where we're driving ourselves into the lagoon, given the fiscal recklessness and indiscipline that is being demonstrated and exhibited by senior people, in government. And unfortunately, I hate to be a prophet of doom. If we continue on this trajectory, poverty is likely to worsen, unemployment is likely to increase, more manufacturing businesses are likely to shut down, and the economy is going to get worse in the meantime, except there is a shock therapy and a fundamental shift in direction that starts with fiscal discipline, at the center.
Yeah, shock therapy, always scares me when I hear that concept, because, it could work or it could fail. It's never 100% certain. But I want to, talk about, first of all, we're not sure where this particular loan is going to be coming from. Is that information that you believe that Nigerians, must be furnished with? And of course, also, can Nigeria be described as a broke country? Is that where we are, completely broke? And so in the future, for 2025, we're going to have to borrow billions and billions of dollars again. 2026, we're going to have to keep borrowing billions and billions of dollars to, pay back loans, to fund deficits, to, carry out capital projects and the like. Is that what we have to accept as our reality, that we don't have money? We're a broke country. The only thing to do is to continue borrowing. Or is Mr. President just not handling, and not just the president now, the ministries who are responsible, are they just not handling the affairs of the country enough to be able to generate money for Nigeria? For example, the NNPC that you just spoke about, and many other sectors in the country, should they be handled better in order for us to be able to generate more income for Nigeria?
Yeah, I think it has to do with both of the things that you have just rightfully and so eloquently identified. That on the one hand, we've not managed our resources enough. We've been wasteful in public expenditure. There's been a lot of corruption in government. And the truth is that we don't have as much money as we claim or that we think we have. Essentially, we're a very poor country. And if you looked at our budget, and you compare that same budget to a country like Kenya or South Africa that have lesser population than we do, you will see that they are spending more per capita income than we are doing in Nigeria. In fact, what am I saying? If you looked at the GDP per capita in comparison to many of these countries, you will see that we're far more poorer. In fact, as we speak today, even Zambia, in terms of GDP per capita, is doing a lot better than we're doing. So we're in a very dire strait. We're a very poor country. Our budget size today, that is 49 trillion, if I'm correct, is smaller than what was budgeted in 2014, about a decade ago, in dollar terms. So we're getting poorer as a country. And so there's no case to make that we're as rich as we thought that we were in the height of the oil boom in the 1970s. I think we must face reality that we're a very broke and poor country, and we must be a lot more frugal with the resources that we have. And that brings me to your second point, which is the fact that have government officials, both at subnational and at national level, done enough to create and expand the pie, that is sort of feeding the entire country? And the answer to that is no. We haven't done enough to grow the economic pie in this country, because the emphasis has so much been about politics than it should be about economics. And we're so driven by this this 6 geopolitical zones, as we should about the fact that there are 6 geo-economic centers in this country. and do enough to drive productivity across these economic centers. And so perhaps if we're likely to shift our emphasis from politicking, because again, I think that one of the problems that this administration is having is that there's too much emphasis on politicking than there is about the economy and governing. And that seems to be a fundamental problem in several years at the highest level of government. So in simple terms, we have to be a lot more frugal with the resources that we have. We also have to be a lot more imaginative, and this is not just from the executive, but also from the legislative. Because perhaps the National Assembly in Nigeria is perhaps the only legislative branch in the world who thinks that their only business is just to approve what comes from the president and just to perform some sort of oversight when MDAs are presenting their budgets to the National Assembly. They do not see their role in terms of providing inputs into budgets, in terms of pursuing legislative policies that add value into economic growth. They don't seem to see their role in those very strategic places that will have enormous impact on the economy. And the National Assembly and State Houses of Assemblies have to be a lot more imaginative and use the legislative framework to also expand the national pie. These are the things that need to happen in a coordinated manner, for us to be able to drive growth and productivity. Otherwise, the evidence suggests that in the last 30 years, except for the brief 4 or 5 years during the Obasanjo years, we have just simply been recycling and producing poverty, giving government policies over the years. And if nothing changes, that's what we'll continue to do until the country gets to a point where it does not have resources to continue to function. And maybe that's when we're going to have a very hard conversation.
Yeah, and the annoying thing with what you just pointed out is that there would be a convenient excuse when we get there. If we get to that stage where, we're completely broken, and beat down financially, there's no money anywhere else, and the whole country is being funded by the IMF or whoever it is, or even the Chinese, there will be a convenient excuse by the government there. They will probably even point back to 2002 and talk about how the PDP stole all of Nigeria's wealth, and that's where we are today, and completely forget these points that you're making. And it's mind-boggling to understand that the president is surrounded by, or has the resources to hire the best economic advisors who can point to where Nigeria's money is being wasted and all the leakages in government, both on the federal and state level, who can point to the president to where Nigeria can tighten up the noose here and generate more money somehow, some way. He cannot argue. The government can't argue that they don't have the advisors that, can show these things to them. Every day that we speak with yourself or any other economic analyst, these things are pretty obvious what Nigeria needs to do or must do, but it's just shocking that we just would never do it. And there's, again, a convenient excuse at the end of every government to tell you why we didn't do it and why we are where we are. Nobody has any issues with borrowing. Everyone would agree that borrowing is fine. America is in debt. China is in debt. The UAE is in debt. Everybody is in debt. But we just continue to do the wrong things repeatedly and somehow just have an excuse to give to the Nigerian people after 4 years of why we failed. Why can the NNPC not explain to the National Assembly about its finances? Isn't there meant to be an auditor general that should be able to audit Nigeria's finances every year and budget implementation for the year and teach us what we must do the next year? Isn't there a National Assembly who should question these things and identify where Nigeria is losing money from? Customs, immigration, there's just too many questions to ask. But again, there will be a convenient excuse in 2027 as to why we failed again. Ayo, you're the guest, not me. I'm frustrated. As a Nigerian, I'm completely frustrated, mostly because I know that we know.
I think that the problem here, the problem is that there is no incentive to deliver economic growth for most politicians. The Nigerian politician is the most comfortable politician in the entire world. There are no consequences for incompetence. There are no consequences for failure, as long as you can buy your vote for 3,000 naira and 5,000 naira. So where's the incentive to deliver on your mandate or to deliver on the promises that you made with the Nigerian people? As long as you can buy your vote or as long as you can wave the tribal or ethnic card you're going to score, you're going to sail home free. So that's the problem. There is no incentive to govern effectively because the Nigerian people do not hold these leaders to account in the way and in the manner that they should, and for several reasons. There's a large pool of Nigerians who believe that progress comes from God and God alone, and so the government really does not have a role in making their lives better, and so they'll rather fast and pray for growth than they would hold the government to account. There are lots of Nigerians who believe that their only way to make progress is to get close to those in authority and eat from the crumbs that fall off the table. And so if you put all of these things together, there's absolutely no incentive for those that we are electing to office to deliver on the goods. I think that progress will only start when the average Nigerian begins to demand more, when the average Nigerian begins to say that, 5,000 is not enough for me to sell my vote. I need real progress. I want the roads to my village tarred. I want my son to get a decent job after struggling all my life to educate that child. That's the only way that we're going to make progress. But as long as you have a situation where, every community is going to run to their senator to pay hospital bills, to pay burial arrangements, and to worship the elected officials, we're not going to make progress. They're simply just going to go to Abuja to do things that advance their narrow interests at the expense of millions of Nigerians, as they're currently doing, and we're not going to make collective progress as a country. So I hope that if there's one message for the Nigerian people today, is that we have to go back to have some sense of self-worth and self-dignity. That if you're going to even sell your vote, please price it at 150,000 naira per vote and not 3,000 naira.
Well, let's hope, because we did see that the prices were indeed fluctuating, vote trading. Thank you so much, Ayo Lawal, for joining us this morning, and we truly look forward to speak with you again.